Oh, there guys. So there was an interesting article in The Guardian last week which looked at lessons to be learned for the left from the recent Dutch elections. So I'm going to start today's video with a simple premise, and that is that most people are decent, ordinary folks who just want a good standard of living for themselves and their family, who want something to look forward to in life, and for the most part, they aren't people who are consumed by hatred or anger. And with that said, there was some really interesting sort of takeaways from the Dutch parliamentary elections last week. So you might remember that in the previous parliamentary elections in 2023, Geert Wilders' right-wing party, the Party for Freedom, they came out as the largest party, and they then tried to govern in a right-wing coalition which eventually folded in on itself and collapsed after the Party for Freedom withdrew due to disagreements with their coalition partners on immigration. Now, in this article in The Guardian, Simon van Teutum, he outlines 5 lessons that we can take away from these most recent Dutch elections that show how the messaging of the far right can be pushed back, and which shows how the left wing can marginalise right-wing voices. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn, and then I'll give my analysis as we go on. So number 1, he says, embrace a can-do mindset. So he says, for years, the Dutch left has often sounded like a nagging parent. Can't do, won't do, impossible. There was definitely a period where the left in general just got a bit too loud, particularly about identity politics. Now, that isn't to say that racial justice isn't important, but people don't want to be told that they're racist or that they're not saying the right things. Sticking to things that can be done and having a can-do mindset is very important and is very powerful. And I'm recording this just a couple of days after Zoran Mandani's been elected mayor of New York, and he was extremely good at this. Every question he was asked, he would just come back all the time to focus on fixing the cost of living crisis, and he would talk about tangible policies towards that end. I think what this point emphasises is that once people's material conditions have improved, generally speaking, people are going to be a lot less likely to be upset about immigration. So by taking a practical approach to things and having a can-do mindset, what you're also doing eventually is moving towards racial justice, but without the shrill finger-wagging of identity politics. And then number 2, he says, be proudly patriotic. So this is quite a simple one for me. Patriotism, for me at least, isn't about putting up flags. We've had this summer of the Raise the Colours flag campaign. That's not patriotism in my eyes. For me, patriotism means doing things to give people pride in their community and in their country. And when I say doing things, what I mean by that is taking action, and taking action to make people's lives better. So, for instance, you sort out your high streets and then you put a flag up. You make train travel affordable and safe, and then you put Union flag livery on the side of the trains. Give people a sense of what being British means in 2025 by what you do, rather than just being against things and just talking about things. If I was a leader of a major political party in this country, I'd introduce a British constitution, I'd introduce proportional representation, and I'd move Parliament to the Midlands. I'd be talking about renewal and patriotic renewal in those terms, and then I'd do it. I wouldn't talk about renewal and then drape myself in Union flags whilst presiding over the same old crap like Keir Starmer does. And then number 3, he says, take off the gloves when needed. And I think this was one of my biggest bugbears with the Corbyn project. Do you remember all that nonsense back then where they used to say, they go low, we go high? Sometimes you have to fight these right-wingers on their own terms. There isn't a single right-winger I can think of who's a good faith actor. They're all bad faith actors, every single one of them. Think of any right-winger in 2025. There's not a single stand-up one amongst them. So when they smear you or when they tell lies about you, you fight back in the same way. Show their hypocrisy and highlight how venal and corrupt these people are. Look at Nigel Farage in this country. He's got more bloody baggage than Heathrow Airport, hasn't he? So there's 101 different ways to hit back at him. So Russian asset, check. Mr. Brexit, check. City banker, check. Beaten by a man dressed as a dolphin, check. By taking this approach, you open up space to expose policy differences, as he talks about in the article there. You need to put a wedge between yourself and your opposition. And just saying, they go low, we go high, is not going to cut it. So number 4, he says, tell an unapologetically left-wing economic story. The right-wing orthodoxy that we've stuck with for the last 45 years is dead. It's as dead as a dodo. So all you need to do in 2025 is present mild social democracy and gentle targeting of the rich, and you are going to clean up in that context. Ordinary people are getting poorer every single year and they've had enough. So you just hammer on those messages relentlessly. Tax wealth, not work. Tax millionaires. Introduce a mansion tax. Just talk endlessly about the cost of living crisis and hammer the rich in that context every time you open your mouth, and you are going to clean up. And then number 5, he says, make a big tent. Now, in the UK, this is actually harder than it appears, because not only have you got the right-wing voting bloc of the Tories and Reform, but you've also got a hardcore rump of centrists, so basically the entirety of the Labour and Lib Dem parties, who absolutely hate the left and who will do anything to sabotage anything associated with the left. Any left-wing agenda would have to either exclude those people or put them where they belong, which is on the outskirts of the big tent and with clear parameters for their involvement. So what you'd have to do in the UK is basically force the Labour and the Lib Dem parties to choose between left and right policy positions. So, for example, we're introducing a mansion or a wealth tax. Will you vote against it and thereby bring down our coalition? And you can only do that, as we've talked about in the other points, with a very clear and unambiguous left-wing political project. It's been well documented now, but there are loads of sort of reform curious voters out there who are disenfranchised and who will vote against the economic status quo if they're presented with a credible left alternative. So there's absolutely no reason why reform voters wouldn't be attracted to a left-wing political project on those terms. And at that point, you'd have a significant voting bloc to be able to say to the centrists, well, look, these are popular policies with both left and right. So you either get on board or you bugger off. So overall, it's a really interesting article. And I think there's a lot we can take away from this in terms of knowing how to push back against the right-wing agenda. For my money, people like Reform, they're not popular. They're just popular because they're on the TV all the time. It's a classic case of manufactured consent. When the left can put forward a credible political project and they don't take any shit, look at Zach Polanski at the moment, they start rocketing up the polls because people just recognise that it's sensible and normal policy. But yeah, let me know in the comments, guys. What are your thoughts on how to push back the far right and how do the left make gains in that context? But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.